Hey guys, it's Dean. Welcome back to the Better Man podcast. Today, I am really excited to have Connor Beaton from ManTalks on the show. I found Connor, was doing some Instagram searching, looking for guests to focus on men's emotional wellness, men's mental wellness, go into all that stuff that we really like to talk about here, going beyond physical fitness. And I found Connor, and I was extremely impressed with the work that he's doing. It it resonates so strongly with the work that we're doing on the Better Man podcast. So Connor, I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So Connor and I haven't met before today. We talked a little bit before the show to shake off some of the awkward vibes. And so my first what I really want to do with this episode is try to understand how you, Connor, how you got into the work that you're doing. Before we do that, I think it's a good idea to explain kind of what is the mission with ManTalks? What are the goals?
Yeah, I mean the goal of the organization is just to give men resources and tools to help them lead themselves better in their life. You know, to lead themselves better as fathers,
Mm-hmm.
husbands, business leaders, to have a deeper sense of discipline and connection to themselves, self-esteem. So our tagline is it's not therapy, it's training. And I like that approach because for a lot of guys, for some men, they're adverse to therapy. They don't want to go to therapy. For other guys, they've tried therapy and it hasn't necessarily worked. It's worked-ish, but it's lacked some of the tactical approaches that we as men often want and need. And so, our organization has a bunch of different opportunities for men to better themselves in whatever area they're wanting to work on, but specifically in the realm of psychology. Relationships is a huge cornerstone for what we do, and to providing tools, resources, opportunities for guys to kind of dive in and do their inner work, as we say.
Got it. I mean, that I have two responses to that. The first is that the shunning of the word therapy can be can be slightly detrimental because it's saying therapy is bad, it's reinforcing that concept. But on the other hand, the idea of reframing it as training and something that is, because when you think of training, it's something that's hard to do. It's uncomfortable. And guys know that. Most guys, I won't say most guys, but a lot of guys have gone through, playing sports when they were younger, playing sports in high school, and, the idea of going to the gym and working out, pushing themselves. So, and that is, I think that's a really important concept to self improvement, to self development. If you aren't going through some discomfort, if you're only trying to optimize strategies and be more productive, then you're skating around the issues. You're going around the deep work that needs to be done. So I like the idea of reframing it as training, and it is a good way to get guys in who are kind of turned off by therapy, but in reality, you are easing them into therapy. So I guess is there a way that how do you do that? How do you start at training and ease into, we're going to talk about some uncomfortable
Yeah, I mean,
stuff?
a lot of it is, the content that I create is very much dedicated towards speaking to men directly versus speaking about men. And there's a lot of content on the internet right now that's talking
Mm,
about men, right? About what men need to do, about what men need to fix, about how, men should do X, Y, and Z, right? Train their bodies, train their minds, be in relationships, how they should treat women, yada, yada, yada. And for a lot of guys, it's not effective, right? It's like, why are you talking about me versus talking to me?
mm,
So the first thing that I would say is I create content speaking directly to men. And I always like to think that there's just one person on the other side reading the message. So that's one thing. The second thing is I share a lot of my own personal experience, and I talk about stories from, the men that I've worked with over the years, because I've been doing this for a decade. I've worked with, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of guys from all over the world. And so I have a pretty large,
hmm
I guess you could say, data set to kind of pull from of real life experiences and patterns that show up within our lives. And I just talk about those things. I talk about how we as men, for example, sabotage. I talk about the roots of those sabotage mechanisms. I talk about, where porn fits into these things, or coping mechanisms like booze and
Mm,
alcohol. I talk about, infidelity and why that happens, and how it shows up in relationships. And I just talk about these things in a very practical way, peppering in, stories from my own life where it's applicable. And I think for a lot of men, that type of approach where they're not being talked about, they're being talked directly to. And
mhm,
then, I'm talking about issues that are relevant for a lot of guys. A lot of men are struggling with things like isolation, where they don't have close friends in their life. I
mm,
talk about some of the challenges that men are facing in our current society. The fact that one in four kids are going to grow up in a fatherless household, as an example, which can be incredibly detrimental to young boys. And I talk about real life challenges that men are going through. I talk about suicide rates. I talk about
mhm,
how 66% of young men aren't dating and aren't engaging in any type of sexual uh, dynamics with anybody. I talk about how more young men are living at home than ever before. And I talk about the real challenges that
mm,
men are facing. And when I do that, men are like, yeah, I'm going through that. I feel alone, or I'm struggling with porn, or I'm smoking way too much weed and I don't know how to stop. And I don't really know why I'm smoking so much weed. So I just talk about like the real shit that
mm,
guys are dealing with. And, if it resonates with a man, then he digs in. And if it doesn't, that's okay. But I'm doing it in a way that's, and I think this is the last thing that I'll say. I'm doing this in a way that is non-religious and non-nationality based
mm,
and non-political. And for a lot of men,
mm,
that is a huge relief, because a lot of the content that's out there that is designed to help men is very nationalistic or very religious based, or
oh my
or is
god,
super
totally,
embedded into a political view. And for me, I can't stand that. I
mhm,
just like, I don't care what religion you practice. I don't give a shit who you vote for. It's like, here are the tools. Here's the conversation I think we all need to be having, if we can strip away some of those other pieces. And if we can do that, we can find commonality as
mhm.
men and have some really meaningful, profound conversations and connections, and build some really necessary bridges, I would say, within our modern day society.
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree with that. I mean, as soon as you identify that you're indirectly or you're coming from a certain political philosophy, you can, some people are just going to listen to whatever you say, but you're also alienating like, 50% of other people. And it just makes the message so diluted. So, I mean, I love that. I love that you're doing that. When I was younger, I think I was more. I think I posted more political things, and now I've shied away from doing that because I think it dilutes the message. I think it's something that um, it isn't. I know some people really like it, but on the other hand, I try to imagine like what would it look like if somebody that I really liked posted something political and it didn't align with how I thought. And I'd think, oh, I really used to like this brand. And now I'm
Mm.
like, now it just feels weird.
Yeah, and
So
there's
I
there's
love that
tons
you're
of people
doing
that are
that.
out there doing that, right? And so if guys want that, they can go find it pretty easy. But if men are looking for a space that is, there's no religious or political affiliation whatsoever. It's not about promoting some type of nationality. That is sort of, you're
Hmm.
all welcome under this banner. Then that's what I'm trying to create, and it doesn't mean that I don't have my own political views or spiritual views. It's just my interest is not on pressing
Hmm.
those onto other people, and my intention is never to
Yeah.
try and commingle those things with the tools and the resources that we're trying to provide men, because those things are
Hmm.
apolitical They're a-religious. They sort of precede those things, and they don't need to be
Mhm.
tied up in those doctrines. And so and again, if
Yeah.
people have those things, I'm totally fine with it. I'm like, go for it. One last thing that I'll say is, I know I could probably be more successful and more popular if I doubled down on those things. That's the funny thing. It's like my account would probably grow much
Right.
faster if I was more polarizing and, picked a political side and, did all that stuff. But you're right, is it would
Mhm.
alienate a lot of people. And so I've had people DM me and be like, how come you're not talking about this political thing that's happening? Or where do you stand on this political thing? Or those types of things. And I'm like, that's not what my work is about. It's not about trying to inform men
Mhm.
about how they should vote or what religion they should choose. That's not it. It's giving them tools and resources so that they can be the best version of themselves regardless of who they vote for or what religion they practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other interesting part of this is you probably have people on either side reaching out and saying like, "Hey, man, you're like, I can tell that you're really aligned with this philosophy, this religion, this this
Yes.
political party. You should talk more about it." And people from both sides will look at that and say like, "This is exactly what we're talking about." And in reality, it's like both sides are trying to claim it, and you're like, no, you can just you can just have thoughts that aren't associated with either side."
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
and that
I, we
we live in
I'm
this very
glad we
strange
discussed that.
time where a couple things are happening that maybe we'll touch on through the course of this conversation. But one of them is that if you have a platform, people who follow you have the perspective oftentimes that you should talk about what they want you to talk about, and that you have some type of
Mm,
social or moral duty to discuss things that they think are important versus the freedom and sovereignty of
mhm,
you as an individual getting to curate the platform in the way that you want it and talk about things in the way that you want. And for me, that's a core foundational pillar of masculinity and of being a man, is that I get to have the sovereignty
mhm,
and authority over how I'm curating something. So that's one piece. And the second piece is
mhm,
we've entered into a time, in my opinion, where for the first time in maybe ever, but for sure, and for the first time in a long time, masculinity is not necessarily being defined by men. It's largely being defined by
mhm,
society and largely being defined by women. And that's not a knock on women. I'm not
mm,
saying that, that's inherently, so negative or bad. But what it does do is that it shapes a lot of men's views on what masculinity is and what it means to be a man based on based on
mhm,
seeking a woman's approval. And so it outsources a
mm,
lot of a man's inner sense of sovereignty. It outsources a lot of a man's independence. It outsources a lot of a man's value and sense of self worth externally to a woman's validation. And so men can get caught running
mm,
around in today's society constantly trying to prove themselves to women in these very small ways because they've been told that in order to be a good man, you have to get the stamp of approval from a woman. And so I think that's one of the things that
mm,
is challenging for a lot of men, especially when it comes to the work. And the last thing that I'll say is that's because the therapeutic space is very much female dominated right now. 78% of therapists are women.
mm,
And when you look at the graduation rates of universities and colleges, you have an abnormal amount of women going into therapeutic and psychological spaces, and a rapidly declining amount of men going into these therapeutic spaces. And so the conversation
mhm,
of therapeutic modalities, how we heal, how we develop ourselves psychologically, they are largely very female centric. All right. So there's this huge emphasis
mm,
on figuring out what you're feeling and validating your experience without looking at where do you feel incompetent? How do you actually develop a deeper sense of competency and capability within your life, which is a very masculine oriented thing. And for a lot of men, when they go into therapy, some of it is that they're feeling something that they need to talk about. Some of it's that they need somebody to witness their
Mhm.
grief or their sadness or their anxiety or depression or whatever it is. But the other part is a lot of men enter into a therapeutic environment because they feel incapable or lacking competency in some area, whether it's communicating with their girlfriend or wife, whether it's a competency of being able to deal with their anxieties, or it's something else, right? That they are feeling insecure or they're feeling depressed because they don't have a certain level of competency in being disciplined, in eating healthy, in moving their body. And they actually need a
Mm.
structured pathway to help them build out that competency in a more robust way, which will alleviate some of their internal suffering. But that's sometimes lacking
Mm.
within the therapeutic field. So I know I just said a whole bunch of stuff, but that gives you a little bit of insight into who I am, what I do, and what I stand for.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot to unpack there. So rather than do that, um, I'm going to. I'm going to focus on just one thing. But you were saying the need for a structured pathway. So in that sense, it sounds like a lot of men are seeking out psychology or seeking out psychiatric support as a form of mental coaching. And I want to kind of use that to segue into your experience and what got you started on this path. Maybe what you were doing before you started this type of work, and the experiences that led you
Yeah, I
into
mean,
it.
in many ways, I was the lost man who was really struggling to find his way in the world, who had outsourced a lot of his validation and worth to women. I was really the archetype
Mhm.
of what I've been talking about. So I I'm just trying to think about what parts of the story I should tell. But I mean, if you had met me 12,
Mhm.
14 years ago on paper, it would have looked like I had a really great life. I was traveling the world. Was riding motorcycles. I had
Mhm.
an interesting career. I was a musician. I had a great relationship with this woman that I really loved and cared about. But behind the scenes, I was a complete disaster. I was using drugs. I was drinking
Mhm.
way too much. I was watching so much freaking porn. It was crazy. There was lots of infidelity. I was cheating a lot. There was lots of lies. And so, I was a man who on the outside looked like he was doing well, but behind the scenes was really, really struggling, and not many people really knew how
Mhm.
bad it really was. And that obviously was not sustainable. Just so we're clear, it was not sustainable. and
Yeah.
and what ended up happening was all of that sort of came to a head, and I hit bottom. I bottomed out. I hit rock bottom. My girlfriend found out that I'd been cheating and I had been lying. I was questioning my career, and I decided to leave that career. And so everything kind of fell apart almost all at once. And I found myself in a pretty dark place. I didn't want people in my life to know that I had been lying and cheating. And so I moved all my stuff into storage. I lived out of the back of my car for a few weeks because I was so ashamed of my actions that I didn't want people to know what I had done. And when I came out of that,
Mhm.
a couple major things shifted the trajectory of my life. One, I was fortunate enough to have a mentor in my life who kind of took me under his wing. And he was in his early 70s. He was this little French Canadian man named Bernard. And I called him my white Yoda. He was like this really interesting French Canadian character who knew a lot about Jungian psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy and Zen Buddhism. And he was in his mid 70s, and I ended up spending, what would happen is I would end up spending about 2.5 years apprenticing with him, and I would pay him when I could. for his time and his teaching. And when I couldn't afford it, I would help him around his farm, and he was, you know, farming asparagus, and I would chop wood and help him with the asparagus farm and help him with his Rottweilers. And in turn, he would teach me about psychology, and he would teach me how to work with people, and he would teach me psychological principles and modalities, and, you know, how to implement them in you know, a psychological analytical way. And so it was this very old form of apprenticeship, you know, sort of like a blacksmith apprenticeship, which,
Yeah. You had
yeah,
an authentic apprenticeship.
yeah, it was
What an amazing
really, really
experience.
profound. And but that came out of me being transparent with him about what was going on in my life, because he was in my life already. And when things started to fall apart after I lived out of the back of my car, I, you know, I kind of came to this moment in my car where I was like, this is not working, you know. And I kind of, you know, had this very, very hard conversation with myself in the car one night, which I wrote about in my book. I wrote a book called Men's Work, and I wrote about it in the book where I'm in the back of my car. I had this like two-door Pontiac G5, which is such a, in my opinion, a piece of garbage. It's such a piece of shit. It was like a 2007 Pontiac G5, and it was black, and it had chrome rims, and it had two racing stripes down the middle and this like big fin on the back of the trunk. It was really this
Oh my
god
God.
awful, you know, exhaust kit and everything. Like it was just, it was terrible, man. It was like, yeah, it's like one of those cars that
It
you
sounds pretty
definitely,
bad.
it's like pimping out a Toyota Corolla, you know, it's like, it just, I don't think it should be done. Um, but, you know,
Yeah.
and I found
Good.
myself back there, and I had, you know, been reflecting for weeks now on everything that had unfolded and where I found myself in life. And I was like, this isn't working, you know, and I can either just
Mhm.
end it, or I can tell people what's going on. And I, you know, had the
Mm.
decent common sense to realize that telling people the shit that had been going on in my life was better than ending it. And so I started to talk to people,
Mm.
and I, you know, told Bernard what had been going on, and he, you know, was very welcoming and kind, and offered to support me and help me through it. And then the second thing that happened was that I opened up to a buddy of mine that I'd gone to university with, and I had actually lived with him. We had lived together in this house with two other guys, and, you know, it was like this really great house. You know, we had parties, and it was a good time. It was the cheap rent, which was also very, very good, although the house was a piece of crap. But
Mm.
anyway, I ended up opening up to him and telling him what had been going on behind the scenes, and I just laid all the cards out on the table. I told him about the lies and the drugs and the booze, and, you know, everything that had been happening. And after telling him and opening up to him about everything that had been going on, I braced for, you know, some type of criticism from him, or, you know, well, like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, what's going on? And instead, he just thanked me for being honest
Mm.
with him, and broke down a little bit. You know, he got pretty emotional, and proceeded to tell me that he had tried to
Yeah.
commit suicide 6 weeks before our conversation. And I remember sitting there
Wow.
kind of dumbfounded, because I knew everything about this dude. I knew what he liked to drink, you know, the type of scotch that he liked, the type of food he liked to eat, the women he liked to date, the TV shows he liked to watch, the sports he liked to check out. But I didn't know the deeper aspects of what he was struggling with. And he didn't know those things about me either. And that would become not just a defining conversation, but I would start to see that same pattern in so many of my male relationships, where I was very close with men, but didn't actually know what was going on behind the scenes. And I started to realize that many of us as men walk through life not actually sharing our struggles with our closest friends. And it's
Mhm.
brutally isolating. And so I would see this time and time again in so many of the men that I was friends with. And, you know, eventually I would start an event where I had men come out and sort of like share their stories. And it became apparent that just countless men were struggling with this. So I'll pause there. That probably
Mhm.
gives you enough insight into why I started what I started.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to speak to that very basic practice of sharing struggles. Like a good example from my own life last week. I'm sure you've been through this. I know you've been through this. every entrepreneur goes through this. But I had one of these moments like a couple weeks ago. It was an evening, and I just hadn't, I didn't
Mm,
feel like I got enough done that day, and I was just thinking like, oh, this is all falling apart. This is all going to fall apart. I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. Like, my wife is going to be furious with me. Like, all of this stuff that I'm building is just not going to work. And I texted a friend of mine. I was like, hey, you ever get that feeling where, everything's just like falling apart and there's nothing you can do? And he said, yeah, yeah, all the time. I was like, oh, thank God. And I felt so much better just to know that somebody else was going through that same struggle that I was going through. And it's something that's so simple. Um, and it's yeah, I think your description of, being close with men, but not really knowing what's going on behind the scenes because men just aren't having real conversations. It's something that I consciously do now with friends is I try to have real conversations, and I try to ask you like what's going on with your life, like what are you struggling with. I'm open about things that I wouldn't normally have
mm,
been open about in the past. I grew up in a very um, small talk focused environment, and anytime someone started talking about something deeper, I was like, can't we just talk about the weather? Why are you talking about these deep thoughts? It just felt really uncomfortable. And then I realized that's what I really wanted. And for me now, when I people that I'm able to have those conversations
mm.
with, I want to hang out with again. And people who just want to name drop and talk about um, people they met and try to impress you with that, I'm like, I don't. This is draining. This just feels painful. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to do this. So anyways, that's my initial response. But I want to ask you about, I want to take you back to, you know, where you hit rock bottom and understand what you truly went through in that process. Like, what did you realize was happening when you realized it wasn't working? What were you feeling?
I mean, I think that behind the scenes, I was battling with a lot of shame. And, one of the things that I've
Mm,
come to realize, because I do a lot of very deep work with men now. And so I'm trained in Gestalt therapy
hmm
and Jungian psychology and developmental psychology. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the best practitioners in North America. And one of the things that I've seen time and time again, and this is something that I struggled with, so I'm going to speak about that personally, but one of the things that I've seen time and time again is that we as men can have a brutally terrible inner dialogue. And the way that we speak to ourselves can be borderline abusive. It can be toxic, even though I kind of hate that word because it's, in in the modern day
Yes.
therapeutic industrial complex, toxic masculinity and toxic this, and it's like, holy crap, like let it go. But it can be just brutal. And the way I talk to myself internally was terrible. And so, if you could pick yourself
Mm,
up and drop yourself into my body when all of this was going on, my inner dialogue was a mess. The way that I talked to myself was terrible. And it
mm,
was terrible because I was carrying on a legacy of how other people had talked to me and how I thought I should be treated because of the circumstances that I experienced as a kid. And what I've come to
mm,
realize is that the majority of men, especially because we're talking about men mostly, um, the majority of men carry on a legacy of how they were spoken to or treated internally. And so, I grew up
yeah.
in an environment where I was oftentimes verbally abused, I had somebody that was saying
hmm
things like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You're a stupid piece of shit. How come you can never get this right? And that was a pretty
hmm
consistent narrative that I would hear. And so I became an adult who talked to myself like that. And I would use what I now call
hmm
dark motivation or shame based motivation to try and get myself to do things.
mm,
So anytime that I did something wrong, how I tried to correct that was speaking to myself in that way, right? What the fuck's wrong with me? It's so stupid, piece of shit. Like, how come you can't get this right?
hmm
And I was carrying on this abusive legacy of what I experienced growing up. Now I realize that not everybody experienced that type of commentary. But for a lot of people, they experience a lot of criticism. They experience no support.
Mhm.
Maybe they experience neglect or abandonment. And all of those things produce an inner
Mhm.
dialogue that is often very shame based. And what we end up doing is we try and use or leverage that shame as motivation, and it never works. It might work for a little while, and you might actually get really good results with
Mhm.
it.
It works
Yeah,
it
like
works for a little bit, but
that's right.
it's like eating sugar, right? Like, you get a little bit of a boost, but
Yes,
it
yes,
messes you up
exactly.
later on.
Like I'll just say I've worked with a number of musicians over the years. Some guys from the biggest heavy metal bands, some rappers, it's like some of the biggest rappers right now. And what's fascinating about the majority of them, and I've worked with athletes and entrepreneurs and all that kind of stuff, but what's fascinating about most of these men is that they have this very shame-based inner dialogue. And what ends up happening is that it
Mhm.
drives them for quite a long time. They can usually have a good amount of success, and then they peak or plateau, or they find themselves with diminishing returns where
Mhm.
they're starting to self destruct and they can't figure out why they're self destructing. And behind it is almost always
Mhm.
this shame based motivation that they have been propelling themselves through life, through their career, in their relationship, in their success, by leveraging this shame mechanism internally. And when it peaks, when it can't get
Mhm.
them any further, they don't know how to break through the glass ceiling. They don't know how to get beyond the plateau and
Mhm.
actually start to develop an internal structure of healthy communication, of healthy self dialogue. And this is what I had to develop. I literally had to do a couple things, and I'll be
Mhm.
specific and tactical here. Number one, I was lying so much I didn't know what was real anymore. I was lying about so much shit in my life. And so I had to develop a practice of catching myself real time in the moment, just embellishing stupid crap, because
Mhm.
I would alter things, I would embellish things. Probably my most common form of lying was just lying through omission. So I just wouldn't say something, if my
Mhm.
girlfriend or somebody in my family was asking me a question, I would just find a way to not answer and I would omit the truth, or I would
Mm.
omit the answer. So I had to
Mhm.
start to correct myself. And this was just kind of like this ongoing daily audit where I was listening to myself talk, I was listening to my thoughts, and I was constantly just correcting, like, nope, that's not right. And I would interrupt myself and say, like, hey, you know what? I don't think that was correct. I think it's actually this. Or, I think I got that wrong. Or, you know what?
Mhm.
I embellished that. Let me tell you what actually happened. And through that process, I started to refine and weed out a lot of the lies and a lot of the um, just nonsense that I was speaking. And as I did that, I started to get very clear on what was happening in my life. And I realized that telling the truth, there's the cliche of like telling the truth will set you free. I think that in some ways it
Mhm.
does, but what it also does is it creates a pathway forward. So if you're a man that's lacking direction or you're lacking clarity on what to do in your life, telling the truth is almost always going to produce a pathway for you to walk. It's going to create direction in your life. So, number one, I had to start to
Mhm.
audit myself, audit my language, audit my speech, audit what I was saying. And I had to, and what I called it
Mhm.
was just autocorrect. I started to autocorrect myself. So, that's number
Okay.
one. And then number two was I started to work on developing an internal structure of self validation, of actually appreciating
Mm.
myself, being able to recognize myself for doing things well, which I had never done before. Like even when I got things right, I would find a way to beat the crap out of myself, even if I had done a good job. And so I had to start to correct that. And so every day I did a couple of things. Number one, I developed a pretty rigorous gratitude and self appreciation journaling process, which we can talk about for people that want
Mm,
that. And then I
yes.
would just practice it every single day. I'd be walking to work, I'd be walking to meet a friend, and internally, I would be having a dialogue with myself that was like, you know what? I'm really glad that I got up and went to the gym today. It was freaking hard, but I'm glad that I did it. And, I appreciate myself for drinking the water this morning and not having that extra cup of coffee. And I'm really, I respect myself for not eating the piece of cake last night and just, letting, or not eating the ice cream last night and actually going to bed on time, even though it took me an hour to go to sleep. And so I started to
Mm,
have this internal conversation with myself that was more about recognition than it was about shame and self destruction. So those are a couple tactical things that
mhm.
hopefully will give men an idea of what was going on, and then we can talk about some other things that might be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, and those are the so I want to go back to the first thing, which is this autocorrect process that you were doing. And I'm curious, number one, what did you did you feel like you had to give something up to create space to be able to have that practice? And then what was it that kept you doing it consistently? What was it that made you keep doing it? Because change is hard, and changing your inner dialogue is really hard. But the way to change it is, like you said, just having that awareness to recognize
Yeah.
what's going on first. And then, and I love that you also, instead of just letting it happen and then not correcting it, you would say, actually, that's not what I meant to say. And then you went back and,
Yeah.
because that's brilliant, because a lot of people
Well,
just
okay. So
wouldn't
this
do that.
is, we're just going to peel the layer back and go a little bit deeper into why do we actually lie in the first place? So part of what I had to do was
Hmm.
discover the roots or the origin of why I was lying so much. And what I discovered was
Mm,
that lying for me was an adaptive strategy. And this is a psychological term, an adaptive strategy. We all have an adaptive strategy to
hmm.
survive in the environments that we grow up in that sometimes are lacking, right? So
Yes.
if you are a child that's growing up in an environment where, if you get something wrong, dad is going to blow up and yell at you or call you certain names, or you're going to get hit, you are going to adapt a strategy to try and keep you safe in an environment where it's not safe for you to do what? Tell the truth, right? You're going to adapt a strategy to help
Mm,
you not have to tell the truth or avoid it, because telling the truth or being honest might get you punished, hit, called the name,
mm.
abandoned. You might not get talked to for a number of days. Like there's just a lot of different
Yeah.
results. So I had to realize, go ahead.
Right. And I think leading to that
Yes,
fear of abandonment, that's what it is. Like it starts as, oh, this feeling of discomfort, but ultimately it's rooted in this very deep fear of, I will be abandoned and people will not take care of me
that's right.
if I don't lie. So I yeah, it's so powerful, and people don't realize how powerful that is until they actually peel back the layers like you did. So
Yeah. Yeah. And what's
yeah.
interesting is that when you look at, so there's a whole field of psychological study called psychological development or developmental psychology. And in developmental
Hmm.
psychology, which is very connected to attachment, which is a very fancy way of saying how we develop our relationships, the foundation of our relationships as attachment. At the root of developmental psychology, what they've found is that in the first 7 years of our life, we're trying to do a couple things. Number one, we're trying to make sure that our environment or our world is okay, that it's secure, that it's safe, that it's trusting. And how that actually happens when we're very, very little, right? Like when we're an infant, is through our mom, through our primary caretaker, because there's not really a lot of difference between
Hmm.
our nervous system and our neurological experience as a baby and what our mom is going through. And so if you're a child growing up with a hyper anxious mother, and you're 6 months old, that anxiety is going to be something that you feel. It's going to be something that you are experiencing, and it's going to color or contextualize your world. The next stage is you're trying to develop a sense of, am I okay as an individual? So you reach about 18 months to 3 years old or 4 years old, and you go through a stage where you're trying to figure out, because you realize, oh, I'm separate from mom and dad. I'm actually my own little autonomous being. And as you go through that phase, and my son's in that phase right now, he's about to turn 3. As you go through that phase, you're trying to figure out, am
Mm.
I okay? And, if I do something wrong, am I okay? Or if I push back, am I okay? And what can happen is, as you're going through that phase, right, which we all call the terrible twos and the whatever threes, as you're going through that phase, yeah, the three nature,
The
yeah,
three
thank you.
nature.
You're pushing boundaries and you're throwing tantrums and you're doing all these things to see, can I be okay and get into trouble? Because the foundation of attachment,
Hmm.
and I don't think this gets talked about enough, and I'll tie this into the work that we do with men, the foundation of attachment, as my colleague and friend Dewey Freeman would say, is to go through a hard time with somebody else and come out the other side okay. Those are the building blocks of
Mm.
relationship. Those are the building blocks of attachment. So the big question that we all have, because you have to remember, a child is 100% dependent on a parent. So what happens as men is we lose sight of that. We lose sight of the fact that we were once one day a kid that was 100% dependent on a parent. And so when they took away attention, when they hit you, when they, told you that you were dumb, or they said, what the hell's wrong with you? Those things were internalized within you to such a degree that told you you can't go through a hard time with that person and come out the other side okay. So we have to be able to
Hmm.
go through those experiences in a large part. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time. So if you're a dad out there listening to this and you're like, "Oh my God, am I effing up my kid?" No, you just have to help them.
I mean,
Yeah, you are for
you
sure.
are, but
We all are, and you're going to.
we
There's no
all
such thing
are.
as a perfect parent. But if you can predominantly help that child go through a hard time, go through the temper tantrum, go through throwing the food on the floor and, driving the trucks into the wall and whatever it is, and come out the other side okay, you will help that child develop secure attachment. You'll help them develop the foundation of,
Hmm.
I'm okay. There's nothing, quote unquote, inherently wrong with me. And my world's okay. It's safe to trust others. It's safe to be honest with them and open, etc. For me, that did not happen. That was not present in my life.
Hmm.
And so I didn't trust others. I didn't think I was okay. I thought that there was something inherently wrong with me. Fundamentally, at the very deep down
Hmm.
core of it, I believed there was something wrong with me. And it came out in my behavior, it came out in my thoughts, it came out in my inner dialogue. And I fundamentally felt like I was broken. Now, that might sound extreme for some guys, it might sound right on the money for other men. But what we have to do is start to look
Hmm.
at our relationship to a couple things. Number one, our inner dialogue, which is going to give us insight into how
Hmm.
we feel about ourselves. And number two, the
Hmm.
primary relationships that we had growing up, which, some men are, don't want to do. Some men just don't want to look at their childhood, and they don't want to give credence and
Hmm.
and power, I guess you could say, to the fact that maybe their childhood impacted them in ways that they struggle to admit or see. But we have to do those two things.
Hmm.
So I'll pause there because I just said a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing I want to say, which you've said but haven't said directly, is that your inner dialogue becomes what your parents told you. So the discussions that they had with you, that's your inner voice. So them saying, you're not good enough. What the hell's wrong with you? That eventually leads to what your inner dialogue becomes as an adult, and that's
Yes,
really significant.
can I
So
tack one
if you're
thing?
looking
Can I
for
tack one thing onto
the
that?
answer,
It It
Yeah.
is either
Yeah.
it's either what your parents said to you directly or what you thought they were
Mm.
thinking. So kids are little bundles of egos,
Mhm.
right? They're just super egocentric beings. Everything is about them. And so if you do something wrong
Mm.
as a child and you can tell that your parent is visibly upset, disgusted with you, disappointed with you, but they don't say anything, you are going to personalize that and you're going to fill in the blanks for what you think they are saying or experiencing. So it's not always this direct
Mm.
conversation of what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? It is sometimes a child filling in the blank of what they think a parent is saying based on what they're observing. Because again,
Mm.
kids are these little balls of ego and they are constantly scanning their parents looking for, am I okay? Did I screw up? How are you feeling? Am I still safe? Is our relationship still okay? And so that can get internalized because a lot of men say,
Mm.
well, you know, my parents, they never criticized me. They didn't abuse me. They weren't, verbally abusive, but I still have this wildly unhealthy inner
Mhm.
dialogue. Now that can have come from a coach or some other type of mentor, et cetera, or it can have come from what I'm talking about, which is you as a kid personalized your parents' maybe avoidance or neglect because maybe they just never
Mhm.
engaged you. And so you personalize that as there must be something wrong with me that you aren't willing to connect with me. And that gets filled in. So I just wanted to
Mm.
add that in because that's pretty important.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm not an expert. That's why I have you here. So, it's not just what was
That's
said, it's
right.
also what was not said. Okay, that's good to know. I'm trying to think of, I'm trying to think of kind of my personal experience with that, and the other thing that I'm thinking about this is there were certain behaviors that were rewarded and certain behaviors that were not rewarded. So, you learn that some behaviors are okay while other behaviors are not okay, which leads you to believe that there are certain parts of yourself that are good and certain parts of yourself that are bad. And so and this is just where the conversation has led me, but for me, and you probably realize this, and we kind of hinted at it in our conversation before with this idea of shadow work, but it's realizing that there is no part of you that is, and you might correct me here, but there's no part of you that is inherently bad, or you can't think of yourself as some part of you that is wrong and some other parts of you that are the right parts, but it's accepting all of the parts of you and coming to terms with all of that. And I think that's a big part of men's work as well, realizing that it's not just, you don't just get to pick and choose the parts of yourself that you like and focus on those, but you have to integrate
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
all
you're,
of it.
you're, you're pretty spot on, right? Is that what we as men do oftentimes, which causes a lot more suffering than it does help, is that when we identify a part of ourselves that we don't like, we try and kill it off. We actually take this very sort of like
Mm.
aggressive, violent approach towards it. For example, I've worked with a lot of men who have struggled with depression or anxiety. Um, and what
Mm.
almost always happens is those men come in, and when I say, what have you tried to do with this part of you? What's your relationship like with your anxiety? Usually the response is, oh, I fucking hate it. I hate it. I hate this part of me, or
Mm.
what do you do with your sexual insecurity? I hate this part of me. Nobody knows about it. I don't tell my buddies about how I'm dealing with this sexual challenge or this problem or this sexless relationship or marriage that I found myself in. I do not talk about those things. So what inevitably
Mm.
happens is that a lot of us as men try and use the tool of avoidance or disdain as a tactic to deal with the elements of ourselves that we don't like. And what it actually does is instead of getting rid of it, because you can't do that, you can't cut out your anxiety, you can't um, you know, lop off your insecurities. What it actually does is it empowers it. It actually creates more strength in that part of you. So Carl Jung created this concept of the shadow. And I think it'd be important to talk about this because a
Mm,
lot of what we've been talking about within my personal story has to do with my shadow was running my life and I had to come to terms with it.
mm,
And this is true for a lot of men, but the shadow, simply put, is the psychological part of you, so part of your identity, that you store all the things about yourself that you don't like, that you're afraid of, that you feel insecure about, and specifically that you do not want others to know about. That's the big one. You do not want other
mm.
people, as generally, especially women, to know about these parts of you, right? You do not want them to know about your fears. You don't want them to know about how you feel insecure, in some way, sexually or financially or in your body. So that's the shadow.
So it's compartmentalization at its best for men. It's putting all the stuff you don't like into a box and keeping it tucked away so you never have
Yes,
to deal
yeah,
with
it's
it
like
again.
sometimes I'll call it like the hurt locker, right? Because it's also the place where we store our
Okay.
pain. Like a lot of men that I've worked with had childhood abuse, whether it's sexual abuse or physical or emotional or mental. And a lot of the times, those men have tried to relegate that pain to to their shadow. It's like, I don't want to deal with this doesn't serve me. If I can just forget about it, then I won't have to deal with it. And where does it go? Again, it doesn't leave you, it just goes into your shadow. And so at some point, and this is a great way of thinking about this, at some point that becomes the dragon that's creating the self-sabotage in your life. So there's an American therapist named Francis Weller
Hmm.
who says that your pain has its own intelligence. Your pain has its own intelligence. So you can think about um, kind of like you've got Superman, and then what was his name? Oh man, I'm totally blanking on the antithesis of Superman, but there's like the alter ego of Superman. And I
I'm
know I can't
blanking.
remember what
I
his
can't
name
help
is.
you. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, evil
Evil,
Superman.
evil Superman.
But
Something.
you can kind of think about that version of you is trying to get your attention. It wants to have a relationship with you, right? Like your resentment. The way I've described it before is, imagine you sitting at a big round table, and you're sort of at the, you could, quote unquote, head of the table. And then on one side are all the parts of you that you like. And they're kind of like the, Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, right? You've got these different parts, your humor, your physical strength, your good looks. Those are all sitting at one side of the table. And at the other side of the table are your insecurities, your fears, the choices that you've made that you're ashamed of, et cetera, et cetera. Now imagine that you only talk to the one side of the table that you like, but the other side of the table
Mm,
wants your attention. They want to be a part of the kingdom. They want to have a say. They want to be seen. They want to be understood. They want to have a voice, but you continue to ignore them. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to talk louder. They're going to try and sabotage to get your attention. They're going to try and kill the other parts of you that you are giving a lot of attention to and affection to. And so it creates all of this
mm,
inner turmoil and havoc. And so for a lot of men, myself included, that's why the sabotage was happening, was because there was this whole other part of me that I didn't know how to deal with, that I was afraid of, that I didn't want people to know about. And I tried to systematically cut it out from myself. I tried to just like ignore it entirely instead of welcoming
mm,
it in and beginning to work on, like, okay, here's this insecurity. How do I deal with that? Is there truth in it? Am I insecure for a reason or a purpose? Or am I insecure because I'm lacking competence in some way and I can actually develop a skill? And so in doing this, we start to work with the shadow, we start to welcome it in. And for a lot of us, for all of us, what I'll say is that there's gold in the shadow. So there's actually this one cool concept, this one
mm,
part that's super important. And Jordan Peterson's talked about this. Whether you like him or not, we'll just set that aside. Jordan Peterson has talked about this notion of entering
mm,
into the cave, facing the dragon because the dragon has the gold. That's a metaphor for facing your own darkness, your own shadow, because in that shadow is the gold. So an example of that, just to take it out of concept and into reality, you might be a guy that grew up being told that men that are angry are bad and evil. And in order to be a good man, you cannot
Mm-hmm.
be an angry man. And so, what did you do? Well, you wanted to make your mom happy because you saw how much your father, his anger and their divorce wrecked her. And so, you disassociate and disconnect from your
Mm-hmm.
anger, putting it in your shadow. It's not that it removes itself from you, it's not that you don't have anger, it's not that it ceases to exist, it's that you
Mm-hmm.
disconnect from it. And that anger is the thing
Mm-hmm.
that you actually need in order to do things like set boundaries, have your own voice, say no to things. And so it's very common that men who are boundaryless, nice guys, constantly saying yes to things that they don't want to do, building resentment in their intimate relationships, finding themselves in relationships with women that kind of run the show and they feel railroaded constantly and they're resentful because of it. It's very common that those men, their
Mm-hmm.
anger is in their shadow. And that's the gold. Being able to
Mm-hmm.
connect with that would actually help them set boundaries, tell the truth, say yes to things that they want, say no to things that they do not want to do. And you have to go and confront that part of you that is kind of scary, or terrifying. So hopefully
Mm-hmm.
that example gives some insight uh, to the men that are listening to this.
Yeah. No, I've lived that
Mm.
example. I lived that example. I had an episode's the wrong word. I did a session with somebody who I had on the podcast. I did an energy session of some, I don't even know what it was called. Um, Basically an exercise he wanted me to do. He was like, okay, I just want you to get really mad. And I was really reluctant to do it because it's really easy for me to get mad. But I didn't realize this until he asked me to do it. But when I was going through that process, and the reluctance behind it was, if I get mad, then I will not be loved. And so I had this deep shame behind anger. And my pattern with anger was, the irony of that was, anger was like my default emotion, because that was, I think part of it was, that was what was acceptable. As for me
Mm.
as a child, I could be angry. I couldn't, I don't know, I, for whatever reason, sadness um, wasn't as accessible. So anger was easy, but it was also something that I had tremendous shame around. And it was a stupidly expensive session, but if I got something out of it, I realized that I had anger, or I had shame behind my anger, and that in order for me to move forward, I had to bring anger into the fold, and I had to accept this part of me that was angry, rather than or accept that anger was a part of me, rather than continue to try to keep it out. I think another really good metaphor for explaining the things that we try to put down, the things that we try to store in this hurt locker. It's like holding a ball underwater. It's like holding a beach ball underwater. And the harder you try and hold it down, the harder it tries to come up. And that's what you think of when you think of emotions, coming out or bubbling out. You're trying to keep it down. You're trying to drown it. And it's, the more you do that, the harder it is, the harder it's trying to come out and come to the surface. So I think all of what you said there is stuff that that men can really benefit from. And then going way back to the start of this topic with the two things that you did: number one, autocorrect, and then leading into the shadow from there. Um, the one other thing I wanted to say is, even if you don't experience these things from your parents, even if there's not someone in your life who is shaping these beliefs about yourself, you absorb cultural expectations and societal expectations about how men are supposed to deal with these things. My dad he is a doctor, and he wasn't at home a lot for me. He was gone like all day. And then he would come home at, I have vivid memories of looking at the clock and wondering, oh, dad's home. And it was like 7:15 or 7:30 at night every day. And so for me, my dad didn't talk to me a lot about these kinds of things. I didn't have someone who was teaching me how to be a man, so to speak. I had, and so my teacher for that was society, and society taught me that men are supposed to be, all the things that we've heard. Men are supposed to be reserved. Men are supposed to be resilient. They're not supposed to complain. They're just supposed to kind of shut up and get work done. And I was rewarded for those behaviors. Those are the part of me that I like to display at my table of me's. Like, oh yes, you pushing through that workout. Good job. You, being tired but not coming out for a sub because you're doing really well and you're helping us, win the game. Good. But these parts of you that were weaker, these parts of you that craved more acknowledgement, those parts were not rewarded. So those were things that
Mm.
I kept in the shadow. So I mean, all of this hits really hard with me, and I say this to kind of share some of my personal experience with that, but also to ask you, what's the path what's the path forward? What's the work involved to addressing these things look like?
Yeah. First, I'd just love to ask you a question, if that's okay. Have you
Please
ever
do.
looked at the connection between your anger and not having dad around?
I don't know. I don't know if I've ever looked at it like that. I think my mom also worked a lot. I lived in a very, I grew up in a very professional oriented household. So dad was a doctor, mom started as a nurse, then became a lawyer. And so I didn't have as much access to my parents. And my mom was, and even now is, very difficult to access emotionally. So all of the goals behind this podcast are addressing the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I really need to work on. So, I mean, to go back to answer your question directly, no, I don't think I have.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the candidness, and in here's what I'll say without going into something in there. In
You can peel me back if you want.
well,
I'm comfortable doing this. There's extreme
yeah,
power and vulnerability, and for some reason, my superpower seems to be expressing vulnerability in a way that relates
love
well
that.
with other guys.
So in the attachment model that my colleague has created, he's 74. He's been doing attachment work and developmental psychology for 40 plus years, trained 6,000 therapists, yada yada yada. In his model, when we are trying to connect to a parent or a primary caregiver, right, whether you're adopted or raised by a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, when we're trying to connect to them and we can't get connection from them, aka we're not getting our needs met, there's two options for us as a kid. One is rage and the other one is shutdown. And those are the two options. And what's interesting is that if we cycle through those things for long enough, what we end up doing is we learn that it's not safe for us to connect to that caregiver. And so, what we end up connecting to, because we all need attachment, what we end up connecting to is some form of addiction. And I'm not saying this is you, I'm just following through the cycle, okay, for the listener. So instead of attaching to a caregiver, we attach to a substance, an object, or a behavior. Substance, object, or behavior. We attach to a substance like food, weed, booze, etc. We attach to an object, right? It might be something that you own, or you might also see women as an object unintentionally, and so you try and attach to those things through porn or
Mm.
OnlyFans, or a behavior like gambling, watching pornography, sex addiction, hiring prostitutes, etc. So when we go through this cycle long enough of being a young boy who's trying to connect with mom or trying to connect with dad, and we can't get that connection, it's not that we stop wanting it. It's that we just look for it somewhere else. So we look for it in the things that are closest to us. For me, it was food when I was younger. And then that would go into a myriad of addictive behaviors, using alcohol, using drugs, using women, using pornography, all as a means of trying to self-soothe because I didn't feel safe in actually building a healthy connection with another human being. It didn't feel safe for me. And so as I heard you
Mm.
talk, what was very clear for me was that rage was how you tried to express as a child that you needed something more than what you were getting, and that you actually needed some attention,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a certain type of helplessness to being a child and wanting attention and wanting closeness and not being able to get it.
Yeah. And rage was also weirdly accepted. Like I played sports. I played football until everybody hit puberty but me, and then it wasn't any fun. So I stopped playing football. But I was still strong enough and big enough, but strong
Mm.
enough and fast enough to play lacrosse, which is, a sport that involves you getting to push people and hit people with sticks. So and weightlifting. I was really very intense in weight training when I was in high school, and so you know having being able to channel that rage into those activities, it was
Mm.
weirdly rewarded. I was commended for being a beast, in the weight room, and being really strong and enduring on the field. So, it was rewarded. But yeah,
Well,
that's just where that
yeah,
took
I
me.
mean, there's a bigger piece in here, and I think it'd be interesting at some point if we did like a session as a podcast, and we could dive into it, and I could help walk you through some of that, if you're ever open to it. And I'm happy to
Hmm.
do that. But maybe what I'll say on the last piece is that one of the most understated things that most men are carrying is some type of deep grief and sadness from feeling abandoned or neglected growing up. The obvious ones
Mm.
are experiencing sexual abuse and physical abuse. It's obvious for most guys, right? We're like, yeah, I got beat up by my dad as a kid. That sucked. I know it had a net negative impact
Mm.
on me. Or my dad had rage issues and would yell all the time. Or, you know, mom would criticize me constantly. And I can see how that had a net negative impact on me. What's harder to see are the ramifications of abandonment and neglect, not having dad around in the way that we wanted, not having some of those lessons and teachings that we desperately craved, having a father who would talk to us about what we were feeling or experiencing, having a dad that would teach us how to do basic things. Like my son's 3. You know what I did with him yesterday?
Mm.
I let him help me chop down some trees on our property. And he couldn't have been more ecstatic. He was absolutely loving life. Like he was so happy. And I have him help me light fires. We go chop wood and then start a fire. And he there's nothing in the world that he would rather do in that moment. So clear, because every son wants to learn, wants to be around, wants to connect with dad. And the vacancy of that and the absence of
Mm.
that leaves a very deep type of well of grief, of sadness, of self questioning. What's wrong with me? Usually is underneath all of that.
Mm.
How come you didn't want to spend time with me? Why wasn't I good enough? We personalize it again. This isn't you as an adult. And again, I'm not talking to you directly, right? I'm just talking in general to the men listening.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the wise,
Mm-hmm.
educated adult that feels that way. It's the child that feels that way. And the thing that I want everybody to know listening
Mm-hmm.
to this is that if we don't deal with that, it shows up in our relationship. That same wound as a child. Why wasn't I good enough for dad to spend time with? Why wasn't I good enough for mom to be around? Why did they have to yell at me? And treat me that way will show up in your relationship, because your primary attachments growing up create the foundation of how you will do relationships. And so what happens is that we become adults who
Mhm.
still have that wound and that pain carrying within us. And instead of healing through it, we project it onto our partner, right? And we say things like,
Mhm.
how come I'm never good enough for you? Or why do you always do this? Or why won't you just prioritize my needs and my wants? Like, how come we always have to do what you want? Or, refusing to just acknowledge our partners when they're desperately saying, like, I just want to know that I'm good enough for you, or whatever it is, right? That is at
Yeah.
the very core and essence of a lot of relational conflict. It's the pain that we're carrying that we then project out into our relationship. And Carl Jung had this great quote. He said, women stand at the very edge of what men know about themselves. Women stand at the very edge of what men know about themselves. Women stand at where a man's shadow begins. Now, for me, this is one of the most profound lines that I have ever read, because what it
Mhm.
told me was all of my fears and all of my insecurities were destined to come out in my relationship with women. They were going to come up, and they
Mhm.
have. And for the majority of men, that's what's going to happen. And it's why relationships are so hard for us sometimes, is that we don't want to admit that our own insecurities and fears and not good enoughs and pain and grief and sadness, they get activated by the person that we love the most. And so the majority of men
Mhm.
that I work with, they have attachment stuff. It's really, at the end of the day, it's attachment issues that are plaguing them in their marriage, in their relationship, in their career, in their work environment with their, CEOs and VPs that they're working with, or their boss, their manager. Their attachment issues that are showing up. And those are the things that we need to start to address.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to say a couple of those pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's getting to the root of those things. I totally agree. We had our I host retreats called Be the Better You, and they're very much, some people come thinking that they're going to be attending a yoga retreat, and they don't read the website, and it's actually much more focused on self-improvement and all the stuff that we're talking about here. And so we have these deep conversations, and one of the guys who came, um, he was the guy who was here to do a yoga retreat. He's like, my wife likes yoga and I want to be better at yoga, so that's why I'm here. And he had this beautiful breakdown where he was so moved by other people's pain and his inability to feel his own pain, and then it was because his dad, he didn't have enough as much time as he wanted with his dad. And the thing that I do, and the same thing that he did, he immediately follows that up with a justification. But my dad was working, he was providing for us, he was being a good father. He wasn't a bad dad, he just wasn't there. And we try to logically justify why we shouldn't be emotionally feeling a certain way, instead of acknowledging the emotion, the emotion that's there. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm kind of curious, like, what does that emotional work look like? What are those? I think you talked a little bit about journaling, but what does that work look like that really helps you get to the root of these
Yeah.
things?
I'm going to give you some tactical things. I first just want to say, you know, it's the role of the father to make room for a son's disappointment, not to be perfect. And the challenge is that a
Hmm.
lot of men feel the pressure of being this perfect father when what's actually needed, like, I'm not going to be perfect for my son. I'm going to be a great dad. Like, I'll probably crush it just to be cocky and arrogant about it. I'm going to be good.
Hmm.
I'm going to help him. I'm going to support him. I'm going to teach him things. And I'm still going to get shit wrong all the time. I'm going to get stuff wrong. I'm going to lose my temper once in a
Mm,
while. I'm going to miss cues of understanding what he needs, what he's asking for. I'm going to get things wrong. And so my job as a dad is to make room for his disappointment when he brings it forward, because that will inform me and give me data and information as to how to parent him better, not because of who I think he needs to be, but because of who he's telling me he is. That's the big kicker. We get so lost as parents, and our parents did this as well, trying to mold and shape our kids into who we think that they should be. And that can be helpful. I'm not saying don't do those things. I'm not saying, let your 4 or 5 year old run wild and be whoever the fuck they want. I think that that's, oftentimes brutal on a child because they need some direction and guidance and structure and order. What I'm saying is when they come to you with a disappointment or a frustration, hear what they have to say. Make space, make room in your life as a father to be wrong, and to hear that disappointment and to hear that opposition. I wrote a quote one day that I said, every son has the right to oppose their father, and it's the duty of the father to accept that opposition of the son. That for me is at the heart of it.
mm,
I know my son's going to oppose my authority one day. He's going to oppose my thoughts. He's going to oppose my way of living. He's going to oppose all of those things. But I know that he's doing that in this beautiful effort to try and define who he is as a man. That is my job. So I just wanted to put that out there. And if it resonates with some guys, great. If it doesn't and they think it's garbage, that's okay too. Keep on keeping on. Um,
mm.
the emotional work,
Yeah.
number one, is you have to be willing to admit that you are feeling something in the first place. And if you're not sure what it is, if you are what I call emotionally constipated and you're not able to get your emotions out, find somebody that you trust, that you can work with, that will help get some of that out. Because for some of us, for some men, they have been so conditioned to emotionally suppress and repress what they're feeling that asking them, and this is what happens to a lot of guys in therapy, is they go into therapy, they start talking about things, and the therapist says, well, how do you feel about that? And the guy's like, I have no freaking clue. I have no idea. Like, I just genuinely don't know what I'm feeling. So,
Mm, yeah. Isn't that isn't that weird though? Like people say like, "How do you feel?" Like I literally have no idea, and I do that. People ask, I have to practice that. How do I feel? Like I don't know. Let me think about it. And then as soon as you say, why am I thinking? Why am I thinking about how I feel? You don't think about how you feel. You
well,
just feel how you feel.
that's the skill that the majority of us as men have not been taught. We have been taught to deal with emotional
Hmm.
problems using rational equations, and it doesn't work. And so, your wife or girlfriend brings you
Hmm.
some emotional problem and you're trying to think your way through it, and it creates more conflict. Why? Because she's not asking for a rational
Hmm.
solution. She's asking for you to witness or understand her emotional experience, not even her emotional problem. She's saying, I want you to reflect back to me what you think I'm experiencing internally, which requires you to be able to do that. So, number one, be able to recognize where
Mm,
you are emotionally. Are you a man that struggles to feel anything in your body, right? Are you stuck in your head? That's okay. Work with that. Find somebody that can help you, specifically somebody that knows what they're doing when it comes to somatic work, somebody that can help you get into your body. Next, is
mm,
begin to do exactly that. Begin to work with the somatic experiences that you're having. So emotions happen in the body. You feel things. You feel heat, you feel tension, you feel tingling, you feel contraction, you feel movement. You feel something that is an energy, right? That's why a lot of people will say that emotions are energy in motion. So you're actually having to tune into the
mm,
information of energy physically in your body, because it's just a different form of information, right? So if you have a thought, I'm angry, that's different than the information of I feel angry, which for me is oftentimes heat in the chest. I feel a lot of energy in my chest. It's almost, I've described it as like the Iron Man core. You know, Iron Man's got that thing in his chest that's his power center. That like
Mm.
turns on for me. And then
Mhm.
all of a sudden I feel it spreading out through my chest. I feel this energy down my arms. And slowly it wants to move up into my face and into my head. I feel heat. I feel, energy in my hands, like a strength in my hands. I feel my feet wanting to move. All of that starts to happen. So you have to start to identify, what do I experience physically when I'm feeling a certain emotion? What do I experience physically when I am feeling a certain emotion? There's a couple simple ways to do this. My framework is you start to work with charge and intensity. Charge and intensity. So every emotion has a certain kind of, we could call it electrical charge, or an experiential charge, or a sensation charge, right? And that charge can be anger, explosive, heat, shame, charge of contraction. Sadness is maybe the charge of heaviness. And then the intensity is just how strong do you feel that charge? How intense do you feel that charge? Is your anger a 2? Is your anger a 6? Is your anger a 9 out of 10, and you're about to explode? So you start to look at, what are the experiential or somatic or physical signs that I'm feeling a certain emotion. And it can help you to just write these things down at first, right? You could just keep like a journal page for each emotion. This is what I did at first, because I was like emotionally illiterate. I felt a lot, but I couldn't differentiate between what I was feeling. And I felt a lot intensely. So I was somebody that, when I was angry, I was intensely angry. When I was sad, I was intensely sad. When I felt anxious or depressed, I was intensely depressed and anxious. And a lot of that was because I had just never taken the time to tune into what I was actually experiencing. So you can write anger on the top of one page, and anxiety on the next one, and grief on the next one, and sadness on the next one, and disappointment on the next one, and shame on the next one. And then just see if you can start to identify, as you go through your days, when you feel anger, ask the question, what does it feel like in my body? What do I experience in my body? And I'm going to
Mm.
give you a very simple cue to help you do that, which is, you have to use the breath. Your breath is the access point to
Mm.
your body, and it's the access point to your nervous system. So, for example, the more stressed out you get, or the more anxious you get, the faster you are going to breathe, and the faster your heart rate is going to go. And that signals to your brain to release stress chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline, etc. And so, if you are stressed out and angry or anxious, a good way to start to tune into your body is to take a deep breath in through the nose, exhale out the mouth like you're breathing out through a straw, and ask yourself, what am I experiencing in my body? And you might want to do that a few times. You breathe in, you exhale out, and you notice what you're experiencing in your body. And what you might notice is tension across the shoulders, tension in the chest. Maybe you feel some heat, or some tingling, or some contraction. And you start to identify what emotion is attached to that sensation. This is just a very good way to go about it. But the breath is the access point. For the majority of us, we're walking through life breathing very shallow, breathing very quickly. And for a lot of guys that come in to work with me, their bodies are almost always in a stress response. Their bodies are like in a
Mhm.
what's called a sympathetic dominant state, which simply means that you are in a more fight, flight, or freeze oriented state on a regular basis. And for a lot of men,
Mm.
they can't get out of that state. And so this is where things like porn, booze, weed come into play, because those things can hijack our system and push us down into a what's called a down-regulated state, or a more parasympathetic state, or more relaxed state, right? Smoking the weed,
Mhm.
jerking off, and orgasming, that hits the reset button, which is why porn can be so addictive. And so you have to start to use the breath.
Mm.
What am I experiencing in my body, to identify some of the sensations, where they are in the body, where your breath is at in the body, how easy or how tight or how quick the breath is. And you want to just start to develop more body awareness. So I think I'll just pause there. Hopefully
Mm.
that gives men enough to go on to begin. But those are some of the tactics to feeling your feelings.
Yeah. Well, I think that segues perfectly into everything we do with manful yoga, which is breath awareness, body awareness. So it's cool to hear that that's a great way to. And ironically, that's probably why I'm doing all of these things now, because I focus enough on breath and body to realize
Mm,
what's going on. What are these other things that are happening? Why am I not happy yet? Um, that's awesome. All right, I have a extremely quick part 2 rapid fire questions, and we'll just burn through them. And you've been amazing at giving long responses, so this one will just be short, and we'll have to wait for more for
cool.
our follow up
Yep.
episode if that does happen. All right, what do you think is the one habit, belief, or mindset that has helped you the most in terms of your overall happiness?
Changing my inner dialogue, having a respectful, appreciative, self validating inner dialogue. Developing that self validating inner dialogue changed my entire world.
Hmm. What's one thing you do for your health that you think is overlooked or undervalued
Overlooked
by
or
others?
undervalued? I mean, I could say all the regular shit. I work out 6 days a week. I drink lots of water. I don't drink alcohol or smoke weed. I'm sober, blah, 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 blah. But honestly, I think the thing that is overlooked and undervalued is I laugh a lot with my son and my wife and my friends. I like, I look for the funny
Mm.
moments where maybe some people would get annoyed with their partner, their wife or the girlfriend, and they get annoyed with their kid. I look for the moments to just laugh at like the benign and arbitrary stuff that happens, because that's just so good for my mental health and it's so good for my physical health. Like I just feel better. So I just look for the moments to laugh.
That's how I feel whenever I watch commercials. Like, that's not funny. I'm like, but
Yeah.
it's funny to me, so I'm gonna laugh. What's the most important activity you regularly do for your
Breath
stress
work. I
management?
do breath work every day.
Breath work. Love it. What's the most stressful part of your life, day to day?
Oh, a stressful part of my life, day to day. I mean, it kind of changes. In the last 2 months, the most stressful part was I just lost my mom. She just passed away a couple weeks ago, and so that was pretty stressful
Mm,
because I live 2,500 miles away from her and my family, and so that was stressful. I went home, I
wow.
spent weeks with her, but it was stressful to try and figure out whether or not I was doing what I needed to do so that I didn't have regrets after she died. So that was stressful, but it was
Mm,
worth it in the long run.
yeah. Sorry to hear that. Um, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing men and their well-being right now?
Mm. I mean, I think there's a couple different avenues to this. I think one is the outsourcing, what I talked about at the beginning, the outsourcing of defining what it means to be a great man and what masculinity is to women in society and culture. I think that is incredibly dangerous. And then secondly, I think the isolation of men from men. I think we under index how much we actually need depth oriented, meaningful male relationships and how much our lives will flourish when we actually have
Hmm.
that.
Yeah. I was thinking about that as you were saying it throughout the show, but I think part of the reason, and you'll probably agree, that we aren't as responsible as we would like to be for the definition of masculinity and being men is that men are isolated from one another. We don't have enough opportunities to get together and talk about these things. And we do that because, at least in my interpretation, because society tells us and has told us that the ideal man works during the day, goes home, takes care with his family,
Mm.
and stays with his family all the time, and doesn't have time to go off and do, guy things. And I'll just finish by saying a lot of my understanding of being a man um, does come from woman, does come from uh, what my mom told me about men, and now a lot of what I've been doing the last 15 years has been unlearning a lot of that, because I realized that that was my mom's frustration with
Mm.
men, and that's her personal experience. That shouldn't have been defining what my goals
Yeah.
should be as a man. So this was an amazing conversation. Probably one of the best interviews I've had on this show. A ton of information in here. I know we jumped around, but there's so many really useful pieces of information, things to explore and unpack. I know for me, I'm going to go look up somatic work in Austin when I'm done with this. So I'm excited to do some of that. Yeah, Connor, thanks so much for having me on here. Wait, I said that wrong. Thank you so much for being on here. I felt like this was your show almost.
Thanks for having
That
me,
was
man. I
awesome. Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah, and what if people want to keep up with your work or learn more about your
Yeah, go
retreats, where
to
can they learn about that?
mantalks.com. We've got an online group with like 500 plus guys from around the world called the Alliance. That's a great place to begin. And online retreats or in-person retreats. And then you can follow me anywhere at ManTalks. I've got my own podcast. We've got a YouTube channel that's going strong, and then Instagram, where I try and respond. So if you have any questions for me personally, feel free to DM me at ManTalks on Instagram, and I usually try and respond to as many of the DMs as I possibly can.
Cool. All right, Connor, thanks again. That was awesome. Guys, I hope you got a lot out of this episode, and make sure to tune in for the next one. I'll see you guys on the next episode. If you like that episode, check out this other one right here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't subscribed, click this subscribe button over here, and you can listen to the full episodes on any major podcasting platform. Full details below in the description.